I've worked as a security guard for most of my adult life, and I thought I'd seen it all. Drunks sneaking into parking lots, teenagers daring each other to break into warehouses, and even the occasional wild animal that somehow managed to trip an alarm. But what happened that night at Ridgeway Industrial Park made me realize there are some things you can't explain by training or protocol. I had just been transferred to the Ridgeway site. Rows of steel shelves, 3 large warehouses, and a small office building surrounded by chain-link fencing. The company manufactured electrical components, and most of their expensive materials were stored in the back warehouse, so the site was heavily monitored. Each building had motion sensors, door alarms, and about 30 cameras that fed into the central control room. Normally, the site ran 24 hours, but on weekends, it was completely shut down. That's when I was stationed there, the weekend night shift alone, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. My first 2 nights went smoothly. I made my patrols, filled in the logs, and killed time scrolling through my phone between rounds. The 3rd night, though, everything changed. It was a Saturday, a little after 1:45 a.m., when I first noticed something strange. The motion detector on Warehouse 3, the backmost building, pinged on my monitor. The system flagged it red for movement detected. That wasn't unheard of. Sometimes the sensors were triggered by rats or moths. But the strange part was that the external camera right outside the warehouse had also gone offline at the exact same time. I frowned, leaned closer to the monitor, and toggled between the feeds. All the other cameras were fine, except that one black screen, signal lost. I grabbed my flashlight, clipped my radio to my vest, and made my way out of the control room. The wind outside was sharp, carrying that smell of dust and wet metal that industrial zones always have after rain. The gravel crunched under my boots as I crossed the yard toward Warehouse 3. It stood in the farthest corner of the lot, near the tree line. The security lights around it flickered faintly from the wind, casting long, shaky shadows over the walls. As I got closer, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The roll-up metal door was slightly open, maybe 3 inches off the ground. I knew for a fact I'd locked it earlier. I crouched and shone my light under the gap. There was nothing visible, just empty floor and darkness beyond. "Dispatch, this is Ridgeway Post 7, I said into my radio. "Possible breach at Warehouse 3, back door partially open. Investigating now." Static. I tried again. "Dispatch, copy?" Nothing. Just a hiss of dead air. At that point, every instinct in me screamed to back off, but protocol said I had to confirm. I slowly stood, unlatched the padlock, and rolled the door up halfway. The sound of the metal rattling echoed through the whole building. I stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, and my flashlight beam caught clouds of dust drifting in the air. The warehouse was mostly empty. Rows of steel shelves, crates stacked in corners, and the faint hum of an emergency light far above me. I swept my light across the floor, looking for movement, until it landed on something that didn't belong. Footprints. They were faint but visible. Wet boot prints leading from the roll-up door deeper into the warehouse. That made no sense. It hadn't rained for hours. My first thought was that maybe a technician had come in after hours, but the alarm should have gone off when the door was opened. The system was armed. I followed the prints cautiously. They weaved between 2 aisles, stopping at a stack of metal crates. One of the crates was slightly ajar, lid half lifted like someone had pried it open in a hurry. I nudged it with my flashlight. The lid fell back into place with a metallic clang that echoed far too loudly in the empty space. And then, From somewhere up above, in the dark rafters, came a sound that froze my blood. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving along the catwalk overhead. I tilted my flashlight up, but the beam didn't reach that high. All I saw were shadows shifting between the beams. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound firm. "Security, you're trespassing. Come down now." No response. The footsteps stopped. I reached for my radio again, but it was still dead. No signal, just static. Something in me told me to get out. I started backing toward the door when I heard the unmistakable squeal of metal, the sound of the catwalk stairs creaking under weight. Someone was coming down. I drew my flashlight toward the stairwell, and for half a second, I saw movement. A figure stepping onto the floor level, head lowered, completely still. I couldn't make out a face, only that they were wearing something dark, like a heavy coat or coveralls, and their boots were dripping wet. "Stop right there," I barked. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward. "This is private property, identify yourself." Still no response. Then the figure turned, not toward me, but toward the far corner of the warehouse, and bolted. I ran after him, flashlight beam jerking across the floor, trying to keep up, but the guy was fast. He reached the emergency exit at the back, slammed through it, and disappeared into the tree line behind the fence. The door clanged shut behind him. I burst through seconds later, but when I shone my light into the woods, there was nothing, just swaying branches and rainwater dripping from the leaves. At that point, I radioed again. Still dead. My hands were trembling. I locked the warehouse door from the inside and backed away slowly. Back in the control room, the monitors had reset, and the camera feed that had gone black earlier was back online. I replayed the feed, and what I saw made my stomach twist. Just before the signal had gone out, the camera caught a clear image of someone standing directly beneath it, head tilted upward, face obscured by the shadow of a hood. Then the screen went to static. I stayed in the control room the rest of the night, lights on, doors locked, eyes glued to the monitors. Nothing else happened until sunrise. The next morning, when the day shift guard arrived, I told him everything. We called the site manager, and when he checked the warehouse, he found something I hadn't noticed. Near the emergency exit, where the intruder fled, the fence behind the building had been cut open. A neat circular hole big enough for a person to slip through. The manager was furious, but there was something else. When he reviewed the motion log, the system showed that the sensor had been manually disabled from the inside at 1:43 a.m. That means whoever it was already knew the system, where the sensors were located, and how to bypass them. Police came, took a report, and promised to increase patrols in the area, but they never caught anyone. A week later, I was reassigned. I didn't argue, but sometimes when I'm driving past that part of town, I catch myself looking toward the line of trees behind Ridgeway Industrial Park, and I can still picture that black figure standing perfectly still under the camera, looking up before everything went dark. I used to think working security at an apartment complex would be easier than patrolling factories or empty lots. More people around meant fewer surprises, right? But that was before I took the night shift at Evergreen Heights. Evergreen was an aging residential complex on the edge of the city. 12 buildings, each about 6 stories tall, arranged around a courtyard and an underground parking structure. The management company had recently hired our firm because tenants kept reporting strange noises, missing packages, and people wandering the hallways late at night. I worked the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, alone, monitoring the CCTV feeds and walking patrols through the halls every hour. Most nights were quiet, flickering fluorescent lights, humming vending machines, the occasional neighbor arguing through thin walls. But there was one building I always dreaded checking, Building 12. It was the oldest one on the property, mostly empty except for a handful of tenants who hadn't moved out yet. The elevators barely worked, the stairwells smelled like mildew, and half the cameras inside showed static no matter how many times we rebooted them. On my fourth night there, around 2:30 a.m., I was doing my routine check of the security feeds when I noticed something odd. One of the hallway cameras in Building 12, the one on the 5th floor, flickered back to life after weeks of being dead. The feed was grainy black and white, but I could clearly make out the hallway. It was empty at first. Then, something moved. At the far end of the corridor, a woman stepped into frame. She was barefoot, wearing a long dress that hung unevenly around her ankles. Her head was slightly tilted, and her hair looked wet, strands clinging to her face and neck. She just stood there, perfectly still, facing the camera. For a moment, I thought it was a tenant, maybe someone who'd had too much to drink. But the way she wasn't moving, not even swaying, it didn't look right. Then, as I leaned closer to the monitor, the camera feed cut to static again. I sat there for a few seconds, waiting for it to come back. It didn't. So, like an idiot, I decided to go check it out myself. I grabbed my flashlight and keys and made my way across the courtyard. The night air was cold and heavy, and all the windows in Building 12 were dark except one, a faint light glowing from a 5th floor window. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The lobby smelled like dust and damp carpet. The elevator button didn't respond, so I took the stairs. Each step creaked under my boots. By the time I reached the 5th floor, the air felt colder. My flashlight beam danced across peeling wallpaper and flickering overhead bulbs. The entire floor was quiet, except for the distant hum of a pipe somewhere in the walls. As I turned the corner into the hallway from the camera feed, my stomach dropped. There were wet footprints on the floor, barefoot, small, glistening under the flashlight. They started near the elevator and led straight toward apartment 5C. I swallowed hard and approached the door. It was slightly open, not enough to see inside, but enough that a thin strip of darkness split the frame. "Security?" I called out. "Is anyone inside? You left your door open." No answer. I nudged the door with my flashlight hand and pushed it open. The apartment was completely dark, except for the weak light coming through the hallway. The air smelled faintly of something sweet and rotten, like old flowers left in stagnant water. I stepped inside. The living room was empty, furniture covered with sheets, dust everywhere. There were no personal belongings, no pictures, no dishes, nothing that suggested someone had lived there in years. Then I heard it, a faint dripping sound coming from the bathroom. I followed it slowly, each step making the floor groan. The door was half closed. I pushed it open with my elbow, flashlight raised. The sink faucet was running, a thin trickle of water, and in the mirror above it, I saw movement, a shape standing behind me. I spun around instantly, flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but the room was empty. My heart was hammering. I turned back toward the mirror, and that's when I saw it again. The woman, standing just behind me in the reflection, head tilted, hair dripping, eyes black and sunken. I screamed and stumbled backward, slamming into the wall. The flashlight fell from my hand and rolled across the floor. When I looked up again, she was gone. I grabbed the light, bolted out of the apartment, and didn't stop running until I reached the first floor. When I burst through the lobby doors into the courtyard, I could still feel that icy air on my neck, like she was right behind me. I ran back to the security office and locked the door. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm my breathing. When I finally looked at the monitors again, the camera for Building 12's 5th floor had gone offline again. I didn't report it, not the way it really happened anyway. I just logged false alarm and equipment malfunction. But the next night, when I came back for my shift, there was a note left on my desk. No one knew who left it. It was written on old yellowed paper, the handwriting shaky. She never left 5C. I quit 2 weeks later. A few months after that, I saw a local news article online about Evergreen Heights. It said Building 12 was being demolished after years of neglect. The article mentioned that during renovations, workers had found remains in one of the top floor apartments, bones believed to belong to a woman who'd gone missing over a decade ago. The unit number was 5C. Now, whenever I take a night shift somewhere and see a security camera flicker to life after being dead for years, I always look away. Because if I don't, I'm afraid I might see her again.